Hello everyone. Today I'm doing a video on the Septuagint and the Book of Esther. This may eventually turn into a series on the Septuagint, perhaps, but in this video I'm talking about how the Book of Esther is quite different in the Greek version compared to the Hebrew, and in my opinion the Greek version is superior. But first, for those who don't know, the Septuagint, which is commonly abbreviated as LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, is a translation of the Old Testament into Greek that was made in the 2nd century BC. They started by just translating the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and this was done by 70 or 72 Jewish scribes. Then the rest of the Old Testament was translated later, as well as some other books that aren't in our Protestant Old Testament. The existing manuscripts that we have of the Septuagint are centuries older than the manuscripts of the Hebrew text that we have, called the Masoretic text, though. So even though it's a translation, I believe the Septuagint is generally far more reliable than the Masoretic text, especially since we know that many rabbis after the time of Christ rewrote portions of the Old Testament in an attempt to remove the clear references to Jesus in it. Now, most Bibles today do make some use of the Septuagint, but they generally still rely far more on the Hebrew than on the Greek, and I think this is a problem. In the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles quoted from the Septuagint far more than the Hebrew, and we know the early church used the Greek Old Testament and not the Hebrew. This doesn't mean we shouldn't use the Hebrew at all, though, or that the Greek text is inerrant or directly inspired, but it does mean we should heavily prioritize the Greek over all other versions. But in the Septuagint, the Book of Esther is much longer than it is in the Hebrew version. It contains 6 lengthy sections that are not found in any existing Hebrew manuscript. These sections are commonly referred to as the additions to Esther, and they are accepted as canonical by the various Catholic and Orthodox denominations. Most Protestants reject the additions to Esther because they think the Hebrew version we have today is older and better, but a few Protestants think these sections do belong in the book and in the canon of Scripture, and I'm one of them. The Greek version of Esther was the one accepted as Scripture by the early church. But what are these sections? What is in them? Well, they have been labeled as additions A through F and appear in different places throughout the book. Addition A actually precedes chapter 1, and it describes Mordecai having a prophetic dream that foreshadows the rest of the book, and then stopping a plot by 2 of the king's eunuchs. Additions B and E, respectively, are the text of the 2 letters written in the king's name that are mentioned in the book. Additions C and D are between chapters 4 and 5, and they include prayers by Mordecai and Esther, Esther's preparation to approach the king, and a more detailed version of her reception by the king. And lastly, addition F is an epilogue at the end in which Mordecai finally understands his prophetic dream from addition A. Now, scholars agree that sections A, C, D, and F were originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic and then translated into Greek, not added in Greek. I'm convinced that these 4 sections are largely original to the book and not actually later additions at all, with the Hebrew version we have now just being an abridgment of the work that has been corrupted by unbelieving Jewish scribes. Sections B and E and the translator note at the end of edition F were originally written in Greek, but I don't think that's actually a problem. I hold to the final form theory of the inspiration of the Old Testament, which is the idea that God inspired some edits to the Old Testament over time, as shown by certain anachronisms in the Pentateuch and elsewhere. The book of Psalms was gradually compiled over time, as were Ezra and Nehemiah. It may be Ezra himself who is responsible for the form of a lot of the Old Testament that we have today. Now, this does mean that the original version of many of the books, which we no longer have, is not necessarily the inspired version anymore, but it does not mean the original forms of the books were not written by the people they claim to be written by, nor does it mean they weren't inspired when they were written or that they ever contained errors that needed correcting. Rather, it means God had different purposes at different times, and sometimes inspired the prophets to go back and make non-contradictory changes and additions to older works. Therefore, it is entirely plausible that even if these sections actually are additions, either in Hebrew or in Greek, they are still inspired anyway because they are part of the final form accepted by the early church. So I believe these sections are inerrant scripture just as much as the rest of the book. But of course, many Protestants and many liberal scholars come up with various alleged contradictions and other problems in these sections that supposedly refute their inerrancy and thus, by extension, their inspiration. So I'll deal with these issues now. First, it has been argued that these sections really are additions based on the fact that the Hebrew version doesn't mention God, and scribes would be inclined to add God to a book of the Bible that didn't mention him. Indeed, Bruce Metzger says, undoubtedly this avoidance of any explicit reference to religion was deliberate, and it has been explained in various ways. Some have thought that the author was a secular-minded Jew, more interested in Judaism as a nationalism than as a religion. On the other hand, because the book as a whole illustrates the working of divine providence by implying that Esther was an instrument of God's will in securing her people's deliverance, it may be that the author wrote at some period when it was extremely dangerous to make any open profession of the worship of Jehovah. However, isn't it possible that secular-minded nationalistic Jews took a longer form of the book and removed God from the story in order to emphasize their own human agency, in order to encourage rebellion against the Roman Empire at a time when their Messiah hadn't shown up as expected? The Jews in the 1st century AD were well aware of Daniel's prophecy and the timeline of the Messiah's arrival. There were thus many false messiahs arising in the 1st century, especially right before AD 70 when the Jews revolted and caused the destruction of the Second Temple. So in reality, the absence of God's name in prayer could merely suggest an intentional shortening by unbelieving Jews, either shortly before the time of Christ or shortly after. In the Hebrew version of the book, the Jews fight against their Persian oppressors and win, without any express mention of God or true religion, though of course his providence can still be discerned in it. But in a time when the Messiah was either expected soon and there were many false messiahs leading people astray, or the time for the Messiah, according to Daniel, had come and gone, with no real Messiah to speak of according to the Jews who rejected Christ, secular nationalistic Jews would certainly want a book in which they defeated their Gentile enemies apart from God in an empire ruling over them. It was Persia in the book, and they wanted to similarly have a successful rebellion against Rome. This would give them a motive to take God out of the book of Esther. Esther is the best book to do this to for that purpose, and really the only one that could work. But for any inspired book that mentions God, it is impossible to remove him entirely, which is why we still see hints of his providence in the Hebrew version. Alternatively, given the second half of what Metzger says, perhaps a more charitable theory is that the Jews needed to remove God from the book in order to be able to preserve the book in a time of persecution, perhaps during the persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes, though this explanation is far less likely since it wasn't done for any other book, whereas the first explanation is particular to the book of Esther. In any case, this argument for the shorter version being original just isn't convincing to me, and even if God really wasn't mentioned in the original version, it makes sense why he would later inspire additions to the book that added him to it. So God not being explicitly mentioned in the Hebrew version is simply not good evidence that we should reject the additions. Now, the first alleged contradiction that I'll deal with is that Esther 16:10, part of edition F, says that Haman is a Macedonian, whereas in Esther 3:1 and 8:3 he is called an Agagite descended from the Amalekites. However, Haman being a Macedonian could indicate political allegiance rather than ethnicity, in which case the contradiction is non-existent. There are other biblical figures that are identified as part of two groups in this way. Haman's political allegiance to Macedonia is what is emphasized in chapter 16 anyway, so it's not at all hard to reconcile. And in fact, we know it isn't talking about his genetics here, because in the Greek version itself, in Esther 3:1 and 9:10, and even in 12:17, which is in edition A, he is called a Bugian, whereas he is only called a Macedonian in this passage where the topic is his loyalty, and one more time after that in the Greek version of Esther 9:23. It should be noted that Haman is technically only called an Agagite in the Hebrew, not in the Greek, at least not explicitly. The reference to his ethnicity in 8:3 is absent in the Greek, and the reference in 3:1 and the two references that are only in the Greek call him a Bugian instead. Now, we don't know with absolute certainty what the term Bugian is supposed to mean. Some have suggested that it is a common Persian name or title that Haman has because of his office, and others have suggested that it is a slur of some kind, perhaps for Hellenized Jews, which would make no sense here since Haman hated the Jews and wanted to exterminate all of them, meaning he couldn't have been Jewish himself. But it is far more likely to be an ethnic term, as I've implied. In fact, most scholars agree that it is just an attempt to render the Hebrew term Agagite in Greek. In any case, I do think Agagite is the correct English rendering for Esther 3:1 because of the connection between Esther and Ezekiel 38-39, which I will do a video on eventually as part of my eschatology series. Thus, it should also say Agagite in 9:10 and 12:17, and there is ultimately no contradiction here. Now, the second alleged contradiction is related to the first one. The issue is that Esther 12:6 says that Haman was incensed at Mordecai on account of the eunuchs, whom he stopped from killing the king, and it is asked why Haman would favor the treason of the eunuchs, because then he would be hating the king and not just Mordecai. But Haman's anger stems from Mordecai exposing the plot, thwarting his own potential gain. Haman is an envious, self-centered man in both versions of the book. He really cares about his own power. Furthermore, as I just mentioned, in the Greek version he cares about the power of Macedonia. Haman being mad at Mordecai here is not at all contradictory to the rest of the book, and he may very well have been plotting against the king in cahoots with those two eunuchs in order to transfer Persia to Macedonian control, as chapter 16 says, so the problem evaporates. But now the largest potential problem for the additions to Esther is that one part, exclusive to the Greek, is very similar to a part in the Hebrew version, and it is argued that it is a doublet, a copy of part of the existing narrative that was inserted earlier in the book, and that there are several inconsistencies between the two accounts. Esther 2:16-23 says that after Esther becomes queen in the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign, a conspiracy by two of his eunuchs takes place against him and Mordecai stops them. But in Esther 12, part of edition A preceding chapter 1, after Mordecai has a prophetic dream during the 2nd year of Ahasuerus in chapter 11, two eunuchs conspire against the king sometime after Mordecai wakes up. Also, Mordecai receives a reward from the king for thwarting this plot in Esther 12:5, but Esther 6:3 says no reward was given to him for stopping the plot in chapter 2. However, there's no discernible reason for the book to have two copies of the same event, or for a second copy to have been inserted later by someone else. That would create a whole host of problems, and just doesn't make any sense. With the axiom of textual criticism that the harder reading is to be preferred, it makes way more sense that a scribe decided to remove this passage from the original narrative because he saw it as problematic, rather than a scribe or translator adding this passage to the text. Indeed, there is even a second Greek version of the Book of Esther that was made much later called the Alpha Text or the Lucianic Recension, and it is missing not the first eunuch plot, but the second, the one present in the Hebrew, since the scribe who made it must have thought that the doublet was a problem, and so he decided to remove one. Thus, it makes sense for Jewish scribes to have wanted to remove one as well, if both were originally present. But all of the apparent problems here can actually be resolved, assuming that both passages belong in the book. The two accounts being of the same event would indeed create various contradictions, so it seems perfectly clear that these are just two different events. The two texts are not intended to be about the same thing. Now, you may think it's weird for two stories so similar to each other to both occur separately in one narrative, but that's just a liberal form of text criticism. There are plenty of doublets like this in Scripture that we know belong there, such as Abraham and Isaac lying on multiple occasions in the same way about their wives. But now, why are there two very similar stories here, though? Well, given that Haman was loyal to Macedonia and was likely in cahoots with the first two eunuchs, it's not hard to imagine that he would simply try the same tactic again, which would solve the problem. However, some translations of the Greek version of Esther 2 say that the eunuchs were angry that Mordecai was promoted and therefore tried to kill the king, which would give them a different motive than this. There are two options here. One option is that these two eunuchs weren't working for Haman and were just coincidentally wanting to kill the king like the other two eunuchs were, but for their own reasons. The other option is that the text can be translated and understood in a different way, such as the Lexham English Septuagint 2nd edition or the LES2 translation, saying that they were distressed because Mordecai was promoted and they were seeking to kill King Ahasuerus. This could be taken to mean that they were already planning to kill the king, presumably due to Haman, and therefore were distressed at Mordecai's promotion, perhaps because they knew he had stopped a similar plot before. Furthermore, their distress due to Mordecai's promotion is only mentioned in the Greek version anyway, not the Hebrew, and it's possible the Hebrew could have a better reading in this verse. But we also have another small issue here. As I said earlier, Esther 6:2 says that the king did not reward Mordecai for stopping this plot as he did for him stopping the first plot, perhaps because he stopped the first plot directly, whereas this time he went through Esther. But in the Greek version of Esther 2:23, it says the king ordered that a memorial be recorded in the royal library in praise of Mordecai concerning his goodwill. The issue is that this allegedly contradicts chapter 6. However, in both versions of Esther 6:3, the king simply asks, "What honor or favor have you made for Mordecai?" And the honor bestowed on him after that is far greater than simply having the matter recorded. After the first plot, not only was the matter recorded as it was here, but Mordecai was also given gifts and a promotion. So this isn't really a contradiction either, especially if the Hebrew reading of Esther 2:23 is, again, better than the Greek, which is possible. Now that these important interwoven issues have been dealt with, there are several other separate issues that are less significant but must still be addressed. One is that Esther was a faithful Jew who followed the ceremonial law in the Greek version, despite her having to keep her ethnicity a secret in both versions. Esther 2:10-11 and 20 says, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. But in the Greek version, Esther 2:19-20 says, And Mordecai was serving in the court, but Esther did not reveal her ancestry, for so Mordecai had commanded her, to fear God and to do his ordinances just as when she was with him, so Esther did not change her way of life. It may be argued that there is a contradiction here, because Esther would not be able to remain faithful to the law and also keep her Jewishness a secret. However, Mordecai also kept his Jewishness a secret from the king while serving in the king's court for many years, despite being pious himself. In both versions of the book, he refuses to bow down to Haman in Esther 3:2-5 and thereby commit idolatry. Some commentators say that Mordecai only did this out of pride and not piety, but the text says they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And most commentators say that Mordecai was being moral here. In Esther 13:12-14, part of edition C, he makes it clear in his prayer that he did it for God's glory and not his own. So if Mordecai was pious in this way, and if he therefore observed the law as the Greek text says, it makes sense that Esther could also continue observing the law and keep her ancestry a secret. Furthermore, the Greek text is likely original in 2:20 rather than the Hebrew, not only because it mentions God, which a secular nationalistic Jew may have wanted to remove, but also because Esther observing the law seems to be a more difficult reading given her secrecy. A scribe would be inclined to change the text here if he saw it as a mistake. And even if it is a mistake and the Hebrew is correct here, that doesn't mean the additions aren't canon, because this verse is not even part of the additions. I'm not arguing that the Septuagint version itself as a whole is inerrant, but rather only that the additions belong in the text. Every version can have scribal mistakes. Now, another alleged issue is that Esther 14:13, part of edition C, says, And removing her garments of glory, she put on the garments of distress and grief, and instead of impressive spices, she covered her head with ashes and dung, and she humbled her body very much, and every part that she loved to adorn she covered with her tangled hair. Whereas in Esther 14:27, also part of edition C, Esther says in her prayer, You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on days of my appearance. I abhor it like a menstrual rag, and I do not wear it on the days of my rest. However, while it may seem that Esther's attitude is contradictory at first glance, it's really not hard to reconcile. As I said, these two verses are both part of the same edition, and the author of this passage isn't stupid whether it's truly an edition or not. In verse 27, she is only talking about her crown in particular, which she doesn't like wearing because it connects her to a Gentile kingdom and king. Verse 13 refers to various other garments that she would normally wear, and it says that she loved to adorn herself, but these adornments and garments are not the same as the crown. And the reason she doesn't like the crown is not because it's too gaudy. She is a woman after all. So there's no actual contradiction here if you have basic reading comprehension. Next, another objection I've come across is that Esther 15:7, part of Edition D, says that Queen Esther enraged the king upon her entrance, whereas Esther 5:2 says that she found favor with him. But this one is just utterly disingenuous. There are two extremely easy ways of resolving this. One is that he was at first enraged, but then she found favor with him later. In fact, this is plainly what Esther 15 itself says outright. And when he raised his face, inflamed with glory, he gazed at her in the full flush of anger. The queen staggered, her color turned pale from faintness, and she collapsed on the head of the attendant who went before her. Then God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness, and alarmed he jumped from his throne, and took her in his arms until she was quieted. He kept comforting her with soothing words, and said to her, "What is it, Esther? I am your brother. Take heart. You shall not die, for our ordinance is only for the common person. Come here." Then he lifted the golden rod and placed it on her neck. He welcomed her and said, "Speak to me." So there is already no contradiction here, obviously, but there is another important thing to note. As we've already seen, the Greek version of Esther is different from the Hebrew version in other ways, besides just having 6 extra sections. Some of the readings and words are different in some verses, as I've already shown, and there are even some parts in the Hebrew that are absent from the Greek, and Esther 5:1-2 just so happens to be one such example of this. So the other way of resolving this is by rejecting these 2 verses. After Edition D, chapter 5 begins with verse 3 in the Greek version, and this makes a lot of sense because Esther 5:1-2 in the Hebrew is really just a shorter, condensed version of Edition D. So when Edition D is present as it should be, those 2 abridgment verses don't even belong in the book anyway. It is likely that a scribe removed the longer version and replaced it with the shorter version for some reason. If this was done by an unbelieving Jew after the time of Christ, or even before Christ came conceivably, a plausible motive for replacing this section is that it vividly portrays a Gentile king as being compassionate towards Esther, and it's not hard to imagine that many Jews, being vehemently anti-Gentile, would not have liked that very much. Since we have this motive, it seems more likely to me that the longer reading is the original and is therefore inspired. Now this argument that I just made may seem to also cut against Edition C being original, since it says, "And you know that I hate the splendor of lawless ones and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any alien." However, this is a quote from Esther's prayer to God, and I've already established 2 possible motives for Jewish scribes to remove God from the book, so it still makes sense that they would remove this section despite it sounding anti-Gentile. Furthermore, Edition D also explains a narrative gap in the Hebrew version. Chapters 4-5 contain much tension regarding Esther approaching the king without being summoned by him, as do chapters 13-15 in the Greek, since she believes that it could result in her death. But in chapter 8, Esther continues appearing before the king without being summoned, as does Mordecai in the Hebrew version of 8:2, though in the Greek version he is summoned. And yet she doesn't seem to be terrified of dying, and there is absolutely no tension presented. This makes sense given 15:10, which says, "You shall not die, for our law applies only to our subjects." Esther would have learned that she had nothing to be afraid of. But the Hebrew version doesn't have this, so there's a gap in the narrative. Furthermore, the tension prior to this is much stronger in the Greek version, with editions C and D making the story much more compelling. But then it might be asked, if the law doesn't apply to Esther, why did the king raise his scepter to her as he would to save someone from death, according to 4:11? He raises it not only in 5:2, which doesn't belong, but also in 15:11, where he touches her neck with it, and in 8:4. And why wouldn't Esther know beforehand that the law didn't apply to her? Well, his raising the scepter may simply be a formality that he does all the time, even when he summons someone, or more likely, it may be that the law actually does technically apply to Esther, but the king was just telling her that he wouldn't count it against her in order to comfort her. This explains why Esther was so afraid without making her ignorant, and also why he raised the scepter later, because it was required by the law for her acceptance. He was simply telling her that he would always do that. But another issue to deal with is that in the Greek version of Esther, the date of the arrival of the second letter in Esther 9:1 is problematic. This is not an issue with edition E itself, which is the text of the letter, but rather only with verses in both versions of the book that describe the letter. I do believe the issue is real here rather than merely alleged, but this does not mean that the Greek version is not still superior to the Hebrew on the whole, and it certainly isn't evidence against any of the additions. It merely shows that the extant copies of the Greek don't preserve the correct reading absolutely everywhere, and thus we can and should use the Hebrew in some places, though this is certainly rare due to it being far more corrupted in general. So in the Greek text it says, "Now in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month that is Adar, the letter written by the king arrived. On this day those who opposed the Jews perished, for no one withstood, because they feared them." But in the ESV, which is based on the Hebrew, it says, "Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out." As you can see, the Greek reading in 9:1-2a doesn't make much sense. If the letter was written in the first month, according to the Greek version of Esther 8:9, which makes more sense than the third month, like the Hebrew says, then why would the letter only arrive in the 12th month, and coincidentally on the very day of the fight it prescribed? It wouldn't take that long to deliver it, given that the first letter was delivered much quicker than that, in only a few days in the Greek. Indeed, Esther 8:14 in both versions say that the second letter was delivered quickly, and then 8:17 describes what happens after the letter was delivered, namely that there was a feast and a holiday, and many Gentiles became Jews, which obviously means the letter must have been delivered quite some time before the battle. So the Greek version isn't perfect, but this doesn't mean that it's not still more reliable than the Hebrew in general, or that the additions don't belong. Now, another alleged contradiction is that in Esther 3:13, 8:12, and 9:1, as well as in Esther 16:20, part of edition E, the letter of the king just discussed, The date for the massacre of the Jews is supposedly the 13th day of the month of Adar, the 12th month, whereas in Esther 13:6, part of edition B, which is the letter of Haman, is the 14th day of Adar instead. However, 4 things should be noted. First, in Esther 3:13, the day of the month is only present in the Hebrew version, not the Greek, and Esther 3:7 in the Greek version, but not the Hebrew, says that it is the 14th, not the 13th. Second, in the ancient world, different calendars and dating schemes existed, which might resolve this apparent discrepancy. Third, in both versions of Esther 9:16-19, the Jews in Susa had to defend themselves on both the 13th day and the 14th day. And fourth, what is prescribed for each date is actually not the same thing, so there is no real contradiction when you actually pay attention to what the text says. In the Greek version, the first relevant verse is Esther 13:6 in edition B, which says, "We therefore have ordered that you utterly destroy those indicated to you in the letters written by Haman, who is in charge of the affairs of state and is our second father, including their women and children, by the swords of their enemies, without any compassion and restraint, on the 14th day of the 12th month, Adar, of the present year." But Esther 8:10-12 says, "It was written by the king and sealed with his ring, and they sent the orders by couriers, how he ordered them to use their laws in each city, both to help themselves and to deal with their adversaries and their enemies as they wished, on a single day in the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar." Now notice how what the king commands is that the Jews prepare for battle and deal with their enemies on the 13th. He doesn't actually contradict the fact that Haman ordered the Jews to be killed on the 14th, but rather he just commands the Jews to be ready and get started a day earlier, which could make sense. And Esther 16:19-20 in edition E says, "And publicly posting a copy of this letter in every place, allow the Jews to use their own laws and join in helping them, so that on the 13th day of the 12th month Adar, on that same day, they may defend themselves against those who attack in a time of oppression." We know that many of the Persians hated the Jews as Haman did and wanted to attack them. So if the Jews were already starting on the 13th, some of them probably would too, but also many Persians did join the Jews to fight on their side. And Esther 9:1 says, "Now in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month, that is Adar, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on this day those who opposed the Jews perished, for no one withstood, because they feared them." Many Persians had already become Jews or would fight on their side because they were afraid of them, so on the 13th day they attacked and defeated the Persians who had still been planning to kill the Jews. And in Susa the fighting continued until the 14th day, the day which Haman had originally commanded. So there's no contradiction here. Furthermore, it makes no sense for the 13th day to be the original reading in Esther 3:13 and not the 14th day in 3:7. The 14th day is clearly the harder reading, despite it being able to be harmonized as I've shown. Why would any scribe change it to the 14th if it didn't say that originally? But a scribe would be motivated to change it to the 13th if it said the 14th originally. And if the letter is forged, why on earth would its author write the 14th in Esther 13:6 instead of the 13th, given the apparent discrepancy, if the 13th is the original reading? What's interesting is that we know from both versions of Esther 3:12 and 8:9 that each letter was originally composed not in one language but in many languages, specifically each language of all the Persian provinces where they would have been posted, which would have included Greek. Therefore, there's nothing stopping these two Greek letters from being completely authentic. Biblical scholar Francois Xavier Roiron thought editions B and E preserved the Greek copies of the real letters. And if the real letter of Haman said the 14th, then of course the original reading of Esther 3:7 would agree with that. The authenticity of the letter and the original reading being the 14th rather than the 13th is the best explanation of the evidence. Another date-related contradiction is that the beginning of the book in Greek, edition A, says, "In the second year of the reign of Ahasuerus the great king, on the 1st of Sivan, Mordecai the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, saw a dream. He was of the body of captives that had been taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from Jerusalem, with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. But the second year of Ahasuerus was 112 years after Nebuchadnezzar took those prisoners. How could Mordecai be that old?" However, there are two ways to resolve this. One option is that the phrase "of the body of captives" simply means he is descended from the exiles Nebuchadnezzar took from Judah, rather than that he was literally one of them himself. The other option is that there was just no problem in the first place, and Mordecai was either just really old, or the number 112 is incorrect. Many of the Jews at this time in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were unusually old in this way, if the commonly accepted timeline is correct. And some scholars, such as James B. Jordan, argue that the secular timeline is actually wrong, meaning Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther take place sooner after the captivity than commonly thought. This is certainly possible, and people living for a very long time in the Bible isn't very uncommon anyway. Moses lived for 120 years, and that is about how long Mordecai would need to live for the longer timeline to work. In fact, even in the Hebrew version, it says something very similar to what the Greek says here. In both versions of the book, Esther 2:5-6 says, "Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away." This could be interpreted as saying Kish was the one carried away, which would align with Mordecai being a descendant of the original exiles, as I suggested, but most scholars interpret this passage to be saying that Mordecai himself was one of the original exiles, meaning he was very old. So using Mordecai's age as an argument against the Greek version is actually just arguing against the book itself. But another alleged contradiction is that in both versions of the book, Esther 9, 6-10a says, "And in it the city the Judeans killed 500 men, including Parshan and Nestain and Dalphon and Aspatha and Paratha and Adelia and Aridatha and Parmasha and Arisai and Aridai and Vezatha, the 10 sons of Haman." Whereas Esther 16, 17-18a, part of edition E, which is before chapter 9, says, "You will therefore do well not to carry out the letters sent by Haman, son of Hammedatha, because he who did these things was crucified at the gates of Susa with his whole household." And some translations say whole family. But if his whole family were already hanged with him, then how could his 10 sons be killed after that? And wasn't Haman hanged on a gallows or impaled on a pole, not crucified? Esther 7, 9-10 says, "Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing in Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, Hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated." There are 3 possible solutions to the first problem. One option, which assumes the translation whole family is correct, is to interpret family to mean his other relatives of the same generation or older, or perhaps just those still living with him, and thus would not have to include his 10 sons. Another option is that it should be translated associates, in which case it refers to all those working with him like the eunuchs had been, perhaps including his wife and friends, but not necessarily his sons. The third option is that it should be translated household, like the New English translation of the Septuagint translates it, in which case it refers to those in his house, such as his wife and servants, and perhaps even still his friends and cohorts, but wouldn't include his 10 sons, who at that point were probably living in their own households elsewhere. So there's no issue here. In fact, the Hebrew version of the book is more problematic on this point than the Greek version, because Esther 9, 24-25 in the Hebrew says, "For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows." This is an actual contradiction. The Hebrew is certainly in error, for the king could not have had Haman's sons hanged on the same gallows as Haman right along with him, because they're still alive months later to be killed earlier in chapter 9. But the Greek here merely says, "So the Judeans accepted just what Mordecai had written to them, how Haman the son of Hammedatha the Macedonian had warred against them, inasmuch as he had proclaimed a decision and had cast the lot to destroy them, and how he went into the king, telling him to hang Mordecai, but as much evil as he had devised to bring upon the Judeans came upon him, and he himself and his children were hanged." This version does not say the king ordered their hanging at the time of Haman's death, but merely says they were hanged, in agreement with both versions of Esther 9, 13-14. But the passage in Esther 16 also says that Haman was crucified at the gates of Susa with his associates or household, whereas Esther 7, 9-10 in both versions says that Haman was hanged on the gallows or impaled on a pole that he made for Mordecai, which was standing at his house. However, this doesn't have to be a contradiction, because it makes sense that Haman was originally hanged on the gallows/pole, but then he was moved to the gates at the time when his household or associates were later crucified there. Esther 8, 1-2 says, "On that day King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman." Esther and Mordecai, being faithful Jews, understandably probably wouldn't want a Gentile corpse on their property. Furthermore, in the Greek version, Esther 8:7 says, "The king said to Esther, Now that I have granted all of Haman's property to you, and have hanged him on a tree." The phrase "hanged on a tree" refers to crucifixion, see Galatians 3:13, which was a very common practice in the Persian Empire, so this matches 16:18. Esther and Mordecai, being given Haman's house, would not want the other people in his household, his co-conspirators, to be there anymore, so they took them and Haman's body and had them all crucified at the gates of Susa. This reading of 8:7 is surely the original reading because it seems to be more difficult, as we've seen, but it is not a contradiction of 7:9-10, nor is 16:17-18. This actually serves as evidence for the inclusion of chapter 16 in the book because it helps explain all this. And the Hebrew version of 8:7, which says, "And they have hanged him on the gallows," actually makes less sense in a way, because this is listed after Haman's property being given away, even though he was hanged before that. But he was crucified after that, though. Now, if it seems weird that Haman was crucified after he was already dead, remember that his sons were hanged after they were already dead, according to both versions of chapter 9, as I've already mentioned, since putting dead bodies on display like this was a common Persian scare tactic. So there is ultimately no issue here. It's not really any different than the apparent contradiction regarding the death of Judas in Matthew 27:5 and Acts 1:18-19, which all Christians agree are inspired verses. The last major objection to the additions to Esther that I will deal with is that the end of edition F mentions Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who lived long after the time of Esther, and it names Lysimachus as a translator. Now, some say Lysimachus only translated the short letter about Purim contained at the end of the book, but it is far more likely that the text means that he translated the whole book, and that Esther itself is a lengthy epistle. Furthermore, as I said earlier, this colophon, as well as editions B and E, are universally believed to have been originally written in Greek, and thus they could not have been in the original version of the Book of Esther. However, while this final verse clearly is a later addition, that doesn't mean it should be thrown out given the final form theory, since other books in the Old Testament were certainly redacted over time, such as the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and Ezra and Nehemiah. And it certainly doesn't mean we should throw out all the rest of the additions, whether they are truly additions or not. Additions B and E and this colophon could still have been inspired by God to be added to the book. As I explained earlier, Royron thought that additions B and E preserve the Greek copies of the real letters, and I agree. This helps explain why Lysimachus would include them within his Greek translation of the book, and why he could be inspired by God to do so, especially given that addition E helps to explain several things, as we've seen. Alternatively, it is even possible that the Hebrew versions of the letters were originally part of the book and then removed later on because they mention God, and also seem at first glance to contradict the narrative, as we've seen. But then Lysimachus was inspired to take the Greek versions and add them back into the book. And since we know that God can inspire someone to revise previous work, obviously that one verse at the end could be inspired. But even if it isn't, that doesn't mean the rest of the additions are not inspired, and that's true even if they actually were additions, like B and E are. However, a major objection to God inspiring someone to make these additions is that the Greek version of Esther was produced during the intertestamental period, centuries after Malachi, and it is commonly believed that Malachi was the last prophet until John the Baptist in the New Testament. But this idea that there were no prophets for the entire 450 years between Malachi and John the Baptist is simply false. When Jesus was born, there was already a very old prophetess named Anna, and there was no mention of either her or John the Baptist being the first prophet after a centuries-long gap. Indeed, Jesus says, "For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John." They didn't completely stop half a millennium before John. We know from historical sources that there were some small gaps here and there when there were no prophets, but this is true during the Old Testament as well, and there is simply no evidence that a total cessation for the whole intertestamental period ever occurred. Under the Old Covenant, God could inspire someone whenever he wanted to. The idea that prophecy ceased after Malachi comes from the unbelieving Jews after Christ, and the reason the Jews promoted it was simply to discredit the inspiration of the New Testament. Why would we trust these Christ-rejecting Jews rather than the New Testament itself and the early church? So in conclusion, the shorter Hebrew form of the book is most likely an abridgment of a longer version, and it was a longer version that was translated into Greek, with the last verse and the two authentic Greek epistles then being added to create the final form as we have it in Greek today, which was the version accepted by the entire early church until Jerome messed everything up by casting doubt on the portions absent from the corrupted Hebrew version. The Book of Esther is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so the only manuscripts of the shorter Hebrew version that we have are from long after the time of Christ, whereas we have Greek manuscripts of the longer version from much closer to the time of Christ. Based on the external evidence alone, we don't actually know with absolute certainty that the shorter version even existed at the time of Christ. But even if the Hebrew is not largely an abridgment, and additions A, C, D, and F really were added later, this was still done in Hebrew or Aramaic. It doesn't matter which, since Daniel and Ezra both have portions written in each language, and it was done before the book was translated into Greek. Either way, the final form we now have, preserved for the most part in our Greek manuscripts, is the inspired and inerrant Word of God, more so than the corrupted Hebrew version we now have. Indeed, the Greek version is much richer theologically. The explicit inclusion of God, piety, prayers, etc. makes it more valuable for the church than the Hebrew version, which seems lacking by comparison. If these things were added rather than subtracted, it makes sense why God would inspire their addition for the better edification of his people. The longer version of Esther is the version we ought to be using, just as the early Christians did. Even the 1st century AD Jewish historian Flavius Josephus relied on the Greek version over against the Hebrew. It clearly ought to be the version in our Bibles. It ought not to be considered merely apocryphal or even merely deuterocanonical like modern Catholics say. It is simply a part of the canon, equal in all respects to the rest of Scripture, and it's time we as Protestants finally acknowledge that. Now in my next video, I'll finally resume my eschatology series, probably in May or so, and I'll talk some more about the Olivet Discourse. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless.